We're using an intensive bed garden system in our vegetable garden, and this system maximizes the amount of vegetables that you could produce in an area by growing plants closer together. Now that's not to say the plants are crowded, but they're given just enough room to thrive. Now here you can see we've already established a series of permanent beds with rows in between, and the idea behind this is that the growing bed is for growing only. We never walk on it. We only walk within the rows, and that helps to reduce soil compaction within our beds. Now another key component to intensive bed gardening is our plant spacing, and I'm going to use checkers and a checkerboard to demonstrate a couple of different ways that we could space plants in the garden. And my hypothetical plant is going to be represented by a checker. It's going to be an okra plant. And we most typically plant our okra. We space them 18 inches apart within the row, and our rows are spaced about 2 to 3 feet apart. And with this kind of spacing, each plant has a rectangular area. It's about 3 feet long and 18 inches wide in which to grow. But we all know that plants don't grow as rectangles. They most typically grow in a circle around a central stem with the leaves more or less evenly spaced around that. So we have a lot of wasted space. All this area in between the plants is just being wasted. We don't need that much area to move and to walk for managing the plants. So we're going to look at a different planting system in which we're planting the okra more equally spaced, and this is a square-centered planting method. And here our within row spacing and our row spacing is both set at 18 inches. And so you could see we could get a lot more plants in a similar area than with the traditional row system. Now there's still a little bit of wasted space here at the center, but we are getting a much more efficient use of space. But the method that we're going to apply even eliminates this wasted space at the corners. And this last type of planting is called equidistant planting. And what we're doing is we're going to plant the okra at 18-inch centers, and we're going to stagger our rows. And you can see, as I move the checkers up, how much more plants we're putting into a similar space. Now each individual plant still has its necessary 18 inches in which to grow, but we have a much tighter spacing, and therefore we could plant a lot more plants in the same area. Even though the plant arrangement looks a little bit different, we're still using the recommended spacing that we would find on the seed packet or in our fact sheets. It's one thing to determine that we're going to use equidistant plant spacing. It's a completely different thing to actually apply that in the field. Now I'm going to demonstrate two different ways that we could seed in our garden: broadcast seeding and sowing seeds individually. And I'm going to start with broadcast seeding. And this is useful for planting large blocks of plants that grow fairly tight, close together, that don't take up a lot of space. Things like carrots, turnips, radishes, spinach, and leaf lettuce. And I'm going to plant some leaf lettuce today in this block, and I've already identified the space. I just marked the edges of where I'm going to plant. Now with broadcast seeding, we just spread the seeds evenly over the surface of the soil. And it's a pretty quick method, and it's useful for plants like lettuce that have really small seeds. And we just want to try to get a nice even distribution. But what we often find is that we're not so good at evenly distributing the seeds, and we end up with a clump of lettuce here and a bare patch of soil over there. So it's actually a good idea to practice this inside before you go out in the field and do it. Lay a sheet out on your living room floor and practice spreading the seeds out and see what kind of distribution you get. If you use a really light cloth against these dark seeds, you can see where they fall pretty well. Once you're ready to try your hand out in the field, you want to make sure that you don't underestimate the power of the wind. If you sow on a windy day, you're going to find all your lettuce coming up in the aisle and not so much in the bed. Now for larger seeds, we like to sow those individually. And this type of precision planting requires a couple of really simple tools. I'm going to use a yardstick and a tape measure. And I'm actually going to be planting seed potatoes, but this same method can be used if we're planting larger seeds like beans, or even if we're transplanting transplants out in the garden. So what I've done is laid the tape measure down the length of my bed, and I'm going to be using this to identify where each row starts. And then the yardstick is used for within the row spacing. And seed potatoes are set out at 12-inch spacing, and I'm going to start my first row 6 inches in from the end of the bed, because that's going to allow the plant 6 inches on this side and another 6 on that side, giving it its 12 inches to grow. And then I'm coming in 6 inches again from the edge of the bed. And so my first seed is going to be set in here, and you can use a bulb planter. This is very useful if you're doing transplants and if your soil's a little bit damper. I have some pretty dry soil today, so I'm just using a small spade. So my next seed is going to be 12 inches from the first. And seed potatoes are set about 2 to 3 inches deep. And if you recall, seed potatoes are actually just sections of the potato. We took a regular potato and we found the eyes and we cut them into sections, making sure that each section had 1 or 2 good eyes on it. And that's where the new plants are going to sprout. So I'm going ahead and spacing these down the row at 12-inch spacing. Now the tape measure is going to help us find where the next row starts. And if you recall from the checkerboard, we're actually not, logically you would think that the next row is 12 inches, but if you remember the checkers, the rows actually get a little bit tighter with the equidistant spacing, and so we're actually starting our next row 10.5 inches down. But remember, we're staggering our planting, so our first plant is going to be 12 inches in, and I'm going to set a few seeds up on the surface just to show this is where I planted. And even though this distance is only 10.5 inches, the distance between the plants is still 12 inches. So they're getting their full 12-inch circles in which to grow. And we're just going to continue in this manner across the rows, continue planting, and then carry this out down the length of the planting bed. Now there's many benefits to using this tight row spacing. One of these is just resource conservation. When you apply fertilizers or when you irrigate traditional rows, a lot of the water and fertilizer actually falls on that empty space between the plants and it's wasted. But with the bed system, the fertilizer and the water is applied to this smaller area where we have the plants growing tightly together, and so we waste many fewer resources there. We also have seen research that demonstrates yields are higher in an intensive bed system per the unit of area compared to a traditional row system. Now when we space those plants tightly together, what happens is we create a dense canopy of leaves over the soil, and this has a number of effects. And one of these is weed suppression. It reduces the amount of light that's striking that soil surface, and so it reduces germination of weed seeds, and those seeds that have germinated aren't getting as much light. They're competing with our crops, and so they're not going to do as well either. Another thing that shade does is it cools the soil, and this can be very important in the heat of the summer. Keeps our roots cooler, and it also slows evaporation of moisture from the soil, so again we're saving water. Another benefit of close spacing is protection against the wind. With that close spacing we get less lodging of plants because they can support one another. And also the wind can be very drying, but with the tight spacing, only that row that's on the windward side is exposed to the wind directly, and so we reduce the amount of evaporation from the plants. And finally, that dense canopy also protects the soil from compaction. It prevents raindrops from hitting the soil very hard and helps to keep it nice and loose. Now, over the course of the season, we're going to demonstrate a few more aspects of intensive bed gardening. This includes 3-season planting. So we're going to have a spring, summer, and fall crop all within the same bed, and we'll look at that as we plant throughout the season. We'll also demonstrate intercropping. And intercropping is when we have 2 or more different types of plants growing in the same space. And we're going to use this in our small space garden, and we'll take a closer look at that in the coming weeks. Now, intensive bed gardening needs a lot of careful planning, and there's many great resources that we can use in planning. These include the OSU Fact Sheet 6033, Raised Bed Gardening, and there's also some wonderful books out there. I've been using the Rodale Institute's Getting the Most from Your Garden. Another good resource is John Jevons' book, How to Grow More Vegetables.